Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and here we go with our video for today's class. Believe it or not, this is the third time I have tried to record this video today. I apologize for the delay, but today several technological issues have prevented me from having this uploaded to you guys earlier. But the third time is the charm. So let's get started. And today's topic in biology class was ions, atoms, and molecules. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the most important concepts that we discussed today and I am going to summarize them for you. And hopefully, this video will help you guys have a better understanding of what we were doing. So today we start on page 35. And the section kind of starts off with what I like to call a bad joke. And they say, or it starts by asking, what do a frog, a skyscraper, a car, and your body have in common? And you think it's a joke, and then they actually tell you they're made of atoms. And it's a pretty bad joke. But anyway, nonetheless, it being a bad joke or a pretty bad way to start a science class, that is true. All of the objects that surround us and living organisms that surround us are all composed of atoms. And it goes on to actually define atoms, and atoms can be defined as the basic unit of matter. Okay? And atoms, as we all know, are composed of three parts. Okay, atoms are composed of protons, which are positively charged particles, electrons, which are negatively charged particles, and neutrons, which are neutral charge. And it's not that they're neutral charge, but it's that there is an equal amount of protons and an equal amount of electrons, and they kind of cancel each other out, the charges. And real quick, so you guys have an idea, and I'm going to try to draw it here. Think of an atom kind of like a circle, right? And inside the circle, the atom has a nucleus. And inside of the nucleus, the atom has protons, which are the positively charged particles, and they have neutrons, which are the particles that basically have the same amount of, has a neutral charge. And outside of the electron, or excuse me, the atom, we have an electron that's kind of orbiting the atom, so to speak, right? Although we know for sure or for certain that the electron that surrounds the atom is in reality a cloud, although we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And so that's basically a very, 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 very rustic diagram of an atom. And atoms, of course, form elements. So an element, if we want to simplify what an element is, we can say that an element is an atom that cannot be broken down into something simpler, or cannot be broken down into smaller units. And it can't be, and your book defines it a little bit differently. Your book, they define an element as a particular type of atom, that cannot be broken down into simpler substances by ordinary chemical means. And what by ordinary chemical means is, if I have an element or an atom of sodium, and I'll just write an A for sodium right here. Have patience with me, ladies and gentlemen. I am learning how to write with this thing. And sodium is Na. Just imagine that's an N. Now, if this is a sodium atom, I can't break this down into anything else, at least not through a normal chemical reaction. It would probably have to undergo a different type of reaction, which is where you pretty much extract a proton from inside of the nucleus. But that we'll discuss a little bit about that a little bit further on. Okay, so let me actually go ahead and clear the drawings, so you guys have an idea of what an element is, and something that is very important, and it's the fact that atoms of different elements differ in the number of protons that they have. Okay, so atoms of different elements differ in the number of protons they have. Okay, so for example, an element such as hydrogen has different amount of protons than an element of chloride. Okay, so that's what it means. Is that what makes the elements different is a number of protons that they have. Okay, um, and for example, all atoms have a different amount of protons. For example, hydrogen has one proton, and let me change this real quick. Let me change it, and we'll change that to oxygen. And oxygen has 8 protons. Okay, so that's another important concept that we discussed today in class. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit about the electrons. So we know that the number of protons differs from element to element because there's a specific set of protons. So, but the electron, okay, specifically, the electrons determine the properties of an element. Okay, so electrons or number of electrons determine the properties. Determine the properties of an element. So basically, the protons determine the identity, and the electrons determine the property. Okay. Um, it says electrons are a cloud that surround the or are considered to be in a cloud that surround the nucleus. So, for example, just so you guys have an idea, and let's go back to that pretty rustic drawing of the atom that I was doing. But let's say here's my proton, and here's my neutron, and let's see if I can, here we go. And here's my neutron, and that forms the nucleus. I'm actually going to draw a little circle to kind of illustrate the nucleus, but I don't, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they look. Anyway, but the electron that we establish is what surrounds the atom, excuse me, the outside of the nucleus is in a cloud. So in reality, this is kind of like a cloud shape thing, or cloud form. Oh, it's a cloud. So just imagine a cloud. Okay. So the electrons are actually in the form of a cloud. Okay. Um, and I think that's pretty much it in terms of the electrons. Um, so Elements in nature, your book establishes that there are 91 naturally occurring elements. That number might have changed to about 94. And I'm going to say out of the 94, and I know your book says 91, but I believe that number is outdated. The 94 naturally occurring elements, 96% of the elements, there are 94 naturally occurring elements. And out of those 94 naturally occurring element, 96% of a human's or human body, 96% of the human body's mass is composed of carbon, which is represented by the letter C, hydrogen, which is represented by the letter H, excuse me, oxygen, which is represented by the letter O, and nitrogen, which is represented by the letter N. And in biology, we refer to them as chun. Now, out of the other 4% is composed of the 4% is composed, excuse me, the other 4% is composed of sodium, which is Na, potassium, which is K, calcium. Let's see if I can move this a bit upward so you guys can see what I'm writing. There you go. Calcium, okay, phosphorus, sulfur, and the others are composed of trace elements. Now, trace elements in are present in your body in small quantities, but are really important. For example, iron, which is used to transport blood to or oxygen to the blood, and that's why you'll hear a lot of doctors and nutritionists suggest that we have a diet rich in iron, and chromium, which helps the body break down usable chemical energy. Okay, so you have iron. Okay, and you have chromium. Excuse me, chromium is actually used to break down sugars. Excuse me, I made a mistake. I confused it there with a hydrogen ion. Chromium is used to break down sugars. Okay, so let's continue on. I'm going to go ahead and clear all my drawings here, and we are going to talk about compounds. Okay, so how or what is compound defined as? So compounds are basically, or is basically, excuse me, a substance, is a substance, compound is a substance made of atoms of different atoms of different elements, okay, atoms of different elements, bonded together in a certain ratio, bonded together in a certain ratio. Now, what it means bonded together in a certain ratio, excuse me, is that, for example, if we have water, we all know H2O, it's in a ratio. For example, 88 to 12, more or less. It varies a little bit, but mainly 88 to 12. And that means that there's 88% of one element and 12% of the other. Okay, so let's say it's 88%, right? 88-12. Now, what that means, that ratio, 88-12, 88% of one element, 12% of the other, is that it doesn't matter if it's an ocean or if it's a drop of water. That's how the ratio of that substance is always going to be proportion, 88-12. Okay. We also have carbon dioxide, which is another type of compound. Okay. And it also goes on to say that a compound's properties are different. So let me actually write that down here. A compound's properties are different. Compound properties are different from the properties of the elements. From the properties of the elements that make up the compound. Okay, let me see if I wrote that in a way that makes sense. Yep. So going back to water real quick. So we know that water is H2O, right? And we know that water is always going to be in a specific ratio, usually 88 to 12. But if we look at water as a compound, you have two hydrogen molecules. So usually you have, 88 hydrogen molecules, 12 oxygen molecules, more or less. But if I separate them into hydrogen and oxygen, they're completely different with a different set of properties. For example, hydrogen and oxygen in their natural state are are gases. Sorry, hydrogen and oxygen in their natural state are gases. But if you combine hydrogen and oxygen, you get water. So that's for example, that's what that sentence or that paragraph is referring to. Okay. So now that we've spoken about compounds, let's talk a little bit about ions. Okay. So what is an ion? And let me clear the drawings so that way I have space again to start talking about what ions are. So if I want to talk about ions, I can define an ion as an atom. Ion is an atom that has gained or lost one or more electrons. That has gained or lost one or more electrons. Okay, that has gained or lost one or more electrons. Okay. So an ion gains an electrical charge. And another thing that I want to mention about the ion, for example, because if a particle loses one or more electrons, if an atom loses one or more electrons, it becomes positively charged. And what that means is, oh, you have to remember. I'm going to try to explain something real quick. So going back to this interesting atom that I've been drawing throughout the video, um, if an atom has energy levels or electrons, although they're in a cloud, they try to fill out energy levels, and an atom is always trying to fill out their their energy levels with pairs of electrons. So usually the first energy level can only hold like 2 electrons, and then the fourth one and the second one can hold 4, and so on and so forth. And I know this does not look very appeasing, but what I'm trying to explain is that to maintain their stability, and an element will either gain or lose an electron in order for it to be considered, in order for it to have a certain stability. So if these are the energy levels here, and if an atom loses one or more electrical charges, then it's considered to be positive, because that means that there's going to be more protons or more positively charged molecules than electrons. And the opposite is also true. And what I mean by that is that if an atom gains one or more electrons, then an atom gains one or more electrons, then it is it has a negative charge. And the reason that it has a negative charge is, excuse me, because it's going to have more electrons than um, it's going to have more electrons than protons. Okay, so let me continue over here. And in our organism, there are a lot of ions that are very useful um, for us. For example, if we have hydrogen, positively charged hydrogen, also commonly known as hydrogen plus, hydrogen plus, okay, hydrogen plus, or positive hydrogen. This is used, or the role that this hydrogen ion is, it's needed to produce usable chemical energy in the cells. Usable chemical energy. And when we start talking about cellular energy and the processes that the body undergoes, um, or that cells, excuse me, undergo to generate energy, you'll understand this a little bit more. The other element or ion that is very important in living organisms, specifically in us, is calcium. And the reason is because, and that's a horrible A, but use your imagination, is that the calcium is needed. So calcium is needed for all muscle movements. So when our muscles move at a cellular level, actually it's the calcium that helps with that. And the last ion that we have in our bodies that we need to undergo certain processes is chlorine negative, right? It's a negative ion. And chlorine is used specifically um, in chloride, excuse me, for certain types of chemical signals in the brain. So they're important in chemical signaling in the brain. Okay, so chloride is very important. Chloride is needed for special special or certain types of chemical signals, not special. Well, we could say special, but for certain types of chemical signals in the brain. So those are examples of ions, how ions form, what kinds of ions are needed in our body, so on and so forth. Okay, so let me actually go ahead and clear the board, and let's go to the. Let's talk a little bit about bonding, and we have the first type of bond, which is an ionic bond. Okay, and ionic bond or ionic bonds form when ionic bonds form um, through electrical force between oppositely charged ions. Form through electrical electrical force electrical force between oppositely charged ions. Between oppositely opposite yeah through oppositely charged ions. And a simpler way of explaining that is that basically ionic bonds are formed when atoms that have opposite charge attract. You've ever heard the term opposites attract? Well, there you go. An example of this is, of course, sodium chloride. So, sodium chloride is an example of this because sodium has a positive charge and chloride has a negative charge, and they actually share, or not they share, the electrical force that they generate actually helps them form that ionic bond. Again, sodium is positive, chloride is negative, and chloride is actually kind of poisonous or can be poisonous if it's in its um, natural state. However, when it bonds with sodium, we have sodium chloride, and that generates an electrical force, which is what helps the negative chloride be attracted to the positive sodium. Okay, now it's much more complicated than that. There's probably some details that I'm missing out, but I just want to illustrate, what an ionic bond is. Um, in your book, you actually have some an illustration of how they form, and it's basically saying that the sodium atom loses one outer electron to the chlorine atom, and then the positive sodium and negative chloride atoms attract and form an ionic bond. Okay, so again, very simple: positive sodium, negative chloride, that forms the bond. And we're going to talk finally about the covalent or covalent bonds. And a covalent or covalent bond, depending on how some people choose to pronounce it, it's that forms when atoms share a pair of electrons. So covalent bonds form when when atoms share a pair of electrons. A pair of electrons. Okay? And they form a pair of electrons. And of course, it says depending on how many atoms um, And depending on how many electron an atom has, two atoms may form several covalent bonds. So an atom can form several covalent bonds, and that's important as well. An atom can form many covalent bonds. Okay? And it actually says that, for example, carbon dioxide, oxygen share pairs of electrons in covalent bonds. This is all three atoms of the molecule carbon dioxide have full outer energy levels. So carbon dioxide is an example of atoms forming more than one covalent bond. And see if I can actually draw it here, or at least write the formula for carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, which is this, shares or has more than one covalent bond. Okay, so very important that you guys understand that. um, and let's move on real quickly to that. So covalent bonds are generally strong bonds. Okay, depending. um, you will see a little bit late in I think in the next section, how an example of covalent bonds aren't necessarily are covalent, but not necessarily um, a strong bond. But generally, covalent bonds are generally strong bonds. Okay, generally strong bonds. And finally, we're going to talk about a molecule and what is a molecule. So the definition of molecule in your textbooks is two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. Okay, so two or more atoms, two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. Held together by covalent bonds. Held together by covalent bonds. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So, one very important thing about molecules, and with this we'll wrap up our lesson, is that all substances that make up organisms are molecules held together by covalent bonds. So, all substances, or almost all substances that make up organisms, almost all substances that make up organisms make up organisms eh, are molecules held together by covalent bonds. Are molecules held together by covalent bonds. Okay. And what kind of molecules that make up organisms are we talking about? Well, we're talking about lipids. We'll discuss those a little bit later on. Nucleic acids, which are very important in DNA. Water are some examples of molecules that make up organisms. And they're all basically have covalent bonds. Okay, so generally covalent bonds are strong. However, in the case of water and some elements are not always that strong, but we'll see that in the next section, hopefully. And again, I apologize for the late post of the video. I've been having a lot of technical issues today. Hopefully this video, one, came out right, and two, it was helpful for you guys. Okay, so we'll see each other in our next class. Bye.